The moment she couldn't hide anymore, the morning light fell gently across the quiet studio lot, casting long golden streaks over the freshly painted set walls. Sandra Bullock arrived earlier than usual, her coffee untouched, her eyes carrying that calm strength people often mistook for peace. No one noticed how her fingers trembled slightly as she held the script, or how she hesitated before walking through the doors. On the outside, she looked like the same confident actress who had faced cameras and crowds for decades. But inside, something fragile was starting to give way. The new film she was shooting with Keanu Reeves was supposed to be lighthearted, a quiet reunion of old friends in a simple story about forgiveness and hope. Yet behind every line of dialogue, there was an invisible weight pressing on her chest. She had been hiding grief, the kind that never truly fades, the kind that only grows heavier when you try to pretend it isn't there. Her mother's passing months earlier had left a silence she couldn't fill, and the world's attention had forced her to keep smiling even when her heart begged to rest. Keanu noticed before anyone else. He had always been the quiet observer, the one who listened more than he spoke, who understood more through silence than words. During the first rehearsal, he caught the flicker in her expression when she forgot a line. It wasn't forgetfulness. It was pain breaking through the surface. He didn't mention it then. He simply offered her a small nod, the kind that says, "Take your time." But that moment stayed with him all day. As the day went on, the pressure on set began to build. The director wanted a raw, emotional scene, a single shot of Sandra sitting alone on a park bench, remembering a lost love. The irony was cruel. Her real emotions were far too close to the script. When the cameras rolled, she tried to lose herself in the role, but the line between acting and reality disappeared. Tears started falling before she even reached the final line. No one said cut. No one dared to. Her quiet sobs filled the air until she could barely breathe. And when the camera finally stopped, the crew stood frozen. No one knew what to do. Keanu was the first to move. Without a word, he walked across the set, past the blinking lights and startled faces. He didn't ask if she was okay. He didn't offer words that would sound hollow. Instead, he sat beside her on the bench, their shoulders almost touching, his presence steady and warm like a shelter from the storm. For a long minute, there was only silence, the kind that heals more than any speech could. Then, softly, Sandra whispered that she couldn't do it anymore. Not the scene, not the mask, not the pretending. Her voice cracked as she spoke, every syllable trembling like it had been waiting for years to escape. She said she missed the way her mother's voice used to calm her before every premiere, how she used to whisper that strength was not about smiling through pain, but about allowing yourself to feel it. She confessed she didn't know who she was without that voice guiding her. Keanu listened, eyes lowered, letting her words find their place in the still air. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm but filled with quiet weight. He told her that grief was not weakness, that sometimes the kindest thing we can do for ourselves is to stop pretending we are unbreakable. He said that she didn't need to hold it together in front of anyone, least of all him. That moment broke something inside her, but not in a painful way. It was like a knot loosening after years of tension. The director called for a break, but no one really moved. The crew stepped away, giving them space, realizing they had just witnessed something more real than any film could capture. The sun had climbed higher now, flooding the set with bright light that reflected off the tears still on Sandra's face. She looked at Keanu and smiled faintly, the kind of smile that comes after an unexpected storm. She thanked him, but he only shook his head, as if to say gratitude wasn't needed. When they resumed filming later that afternoon, the energy was different. Sandra's performance wasn't acting anymore, it was truth. Each word carried the weight of her loss, but also the light of her healing. Keanu's scenes with her became quieter, slower, filled with unspoken care. It was as though the camera captured something invisible between them, respect, empathy, and a silent promise that neither of them had to face their pain alone. That evening, when most of the crew had left, Sandra sat on the steps outside the studio. The air smelled faintly of rain, and she watched the sky turn from gold to gray. She replayed the day in her mind, the way her emotions had spilled out, the way Keanu had simply been there without asking for anything in return. Part of her felt embarrassed for breaking down in front of everyone. Another part felt lighter than she had in months. As she sat there, Keanu returned with 2 paper cups of tea instead of coffee. He handed one to her and sat down beside her again, quiet as always. She asked him why he was always so calm, how he managed to carry his own losses without letting them crush him. He thought for a moment and said that maybe peace doesn't come from avoiding pain. It comes from accepting that pain is part of love. That to lose something deeply means we once had something worth remembering. His words hit her harder than she expected, and for a long while, they both sat there watching the quiet drizzle fall across the lot. Before leaving, Keanu turned to her and said she didn't need to act tomorrow. He told her she could just be herself, and that would be enough. She nodded, but there was something in his voice that made her wonder if he was also speaking to himself. He walked away with that same gentle grace, leaving her with the feeling that somehow her breakdown had been the beginning of something, not the end. What neither of them knew that night was how much that single day would change both their lives. It would become the turning point in their friendship, and in ways they could not yet imagine. It would lead to a moment months later that would test every word they had said about strength, kindness, and loss. The sound of rain grew heavier, echoing softly through the empty lot. Sandra closed her eyes, holding the warmth of the tea in her hands, and whispered to herself that maybe, just maybe, she was ready to stop pretending. But as she looked toward the quiet corridor where Keanu had disappeared, she felt something uneasy stir deep inside. A subtle sense that the peace she felt tonight would not last. The next day, something unexpected would happen on set. Something that would shake both of them in a way neither could have predicted. The day everything changed, the morning after her breakdown felt strangely calm. The sky above the studio was a pale shade of silver, and the air carried that cool stillness that comes right before something unexpected. Sandra arrived a little later than usual, her eyes softer, her movements slower, but her heart slightly lighter than before. She had barely slept, but for the first time in months, her mind wasn't filled with noise. She had spent the night thinking about what Keanu said, how peace might come from accepting pain instead of hiding it. She didn't know if she fully believed it yet, but it gave her something to hold on to. Inside the studio, the crew moved quietly, as if trying not to disturb the fragile sense of calm that hung in the air. Everyone had seen her break the day before, but no one treated her differently. Maybe it was because Keanu had spoken to them after she left, reminding them to give her space. Or maybe it was because they had all witnessed something real and honest that touched them too. In an industry full of polished perfection, her tears had reminded everyone that humanity still mattered more than image. When Keanu arrived, Sandra noticed immediately. He walked in wearing the same black jacket from the day before, his hair slightly damp from the drizzle outside, his face unreadable but kind. He greeted the crew softly, then met her eyes across the set. There was no awkwardness, only quiet understanding. He didn't ask how she was doing, and she was grateful for that. Sometimes silence was the best form of respect. They were scheduled to film a scene together that morning, one that mirrored the real emotions they had shared only hours earlier. The script described 2 old friends meeting after years apart, both carrying wounds they never talked about. It was meant to be gentle, reflective, filled with pauses and unsaid words. When the director called action, the room seemed to hold its breath. Sandra looked at Keanu, and for a moment she wasn't acting. Her eyes softened, and the tremor in her voice wasn't scripted. She told him she was sorry for disappearing years ago, for shutting him out when she was afraid of being seen as weak. Keanu's reply wasn't entirely from the script either. He said that sometimes people need to disappear to find the pieces of themselves they lost. The words hit her so deeply that she forgot her next line. Instead, she whispered something not in the dialogue. She said she was scared of losing herself again. And the silence that followed was more powerful than anything written on paper. When the director finally yelled cut, no one moved. It was as though the entire set had witnessed something sacred, something too real to interrupt. The director's eyes glistened slightly, and even the camera operator stood frozen, afraid that moving would break the fragile spell. Keanu smiled faintly, that small, knowing smile that carried years of quiet wisdom, and said softly that she had just given them a scene they would never forget. During the lunch break, Sandra sat alone under a tree behind the studio. She needed to breathe, to let the emotions settle. The world seemed strangely quiet, except for the gentle rustle of leaves. She thought about how different Keanu was from most people she had worked with. There was no ego in him, no need to be the center of attention. He carried his kindness like a quiet flame, steady but never demanding to be seen. She wondered how he managed it. How someone could go through so much pain and still be so calm. As she was lost in thought, she heard footsteps approaching. It was Keanu holding 2 cups of tea again. He sat down beside her without asking and handed her one. She smiled, realizing he had remembered she preferred tea to coffee after that day. They sat quietly for a few minutes before he spoke. He told her he used to come to this same spot years ago when he was younger, whenever he felt overwhelmed. He said it helped him remember that everything passes, the good, the bad, the unbearable. She listened, watching the way he spoke with such softness, as if every word was measured with care. Then, something in his expression changed. He hesitated before speaking again, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of unease in his eyes. He told her that the film they were making was not just another project to him. He said he had accepted the role because the story reminded him of someone he once knew, someone he had lost. His voice grew quieter, almost breaking when he said her name. Sandra didn't interrupt, even though she wanted to. She sensed this was something he hadn't shared with anyone in a long time. He told her about Jennifer, the woman he had once loved deeply. She had passed away years ago in a tragic accident. His voice trembled when he said that no matter how much time passed, the memory still felt raw. He said he learned that grief never truly disappears. It simply changes shape. Sometimes it becomes silence, sometimes it becomes kindness. He told her that every act of compassion he offered came from that same place of loss, that he didn't want anyone to feel as alone as he once did. Sandra's eyes filled with tears as she listened. She realized then that the quiet strength she admired in him was born from pain, not perfection, that his calm was not the absence of sorrow, but the acceptance of it. She wanted to say something comforting, but words felt small compared to what he had just shared. So she simply placed her hand on his, letting her silence speak for her. For a brief moment, it felt like both of them were standing at the edge of something they didn't yet understand. That afternoon, filming resumed, but something unexpected happened. During a complex emotional scene, the studio lights suddenly flickered and went out, leaving only the soft glow of the emergency lamps. The director decided to pause the shoot, but Sandra and Keanu kept going. In that dim light, something about the scene became hauntingly beautiful. They continued speaking their lines, their faces half-lit, their voices low but trembling with emotion. The crew stayed silent, watching in awe. It felt less like a movie, and more like 2 souls finding each other in the dark. When the power came back, no one clapped, no one cheered. The silence in the room was heavy but meaningful. The director finally whispered that they had captured magic. Sandra turned to Keanu, her heart beating fast, realizing how connected she felt to him in that moment. But deep inside, she also felt fear that this connection was becoming something more than friendship. Something fragile, powerful, and dangerous. That evening, as she drove home, her thoughts were restless. She replayed his story in her head, the way his voice broke when he said her name, the pain behind his calm. She realized she wanted to protect him the way he had protected her, but she also knew how dangerous that feeling could be. Hollywood was full of stories that blurred the line between real emotion and performance. She didn't want to lose herself in one. When she reached home, she found an envelope waiting by her door. It had no name, no stamp, just her initials written in delicate handwriting. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling. Inside was a small photograph, an old picture of her and Keanu from their first film together years ago, smiling and carefree. Beneath it was a short note that said, "You've always had the light, even when you couldn't see it." There was no signature, but she knew exactly who it was from. That night, she couldn't sleep. The photo lay beside her on the nightstand, and she kept staring at it, wondering why he had sent it now. Was it meant as comfort, or was there something he wasn't saying? The thought lingered until dawn, and when she finally closed her eyes, She dreamed of standing on that same film set again, but this time, the lights never came back on, and she couldn't find him anywhere in the darkness. The next morning would bring an unexpected call, one that would pull both of them into a situation far beyond what either of them could have imagined. A moment that would test not only their friendship, but everything they believed about love, loss, and the meaning of strength. The call that changed everything. The next morning began like any other, but there was an unease in the air that Sandra couldn't name. The city was still half asleep, the sky a pale mix of blue and white, but something about the quiet felt unnatural. She sat at her kitchen table, her fingers tracing the rim of her mug, the photo from Keanu still resting beside her. She had promised herself she wouldn't overthink it, but she couldn't shake the feeling that it meant something more than comfort. Just as she reached for her phone, it began to ring. The name on the screen made her heart stop. It was the director. His voice sounded off, strained, hurried, uncertain. He told her that there had been an accident on set. A lighting rig had collapsed early that morning while the crew was preparing the next day's scene. Several people were hurt, and Keanu had been there. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. She asked if he was okay, but the director hesitated before answering. He said Keanu was taken to the hospital with a concussion and some injuries. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough to stop production for a few days. Sandra stood frozen, the phone pressed to her ear, her thoughts dissolving into static. She grabbed her keys and left before the call even ended. The drive to the hospital felt endless. Every red light, every slow car in front of her felt like a cruel test of patience. Her hands gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned pale. Her mind raced through 1,000 memories, his calm voice, his quiet smile, the way he had told her to stop pretending. She realized she had come to rely on his steadiness far more than she had admitted, even to herself. When she finally reached the hospital, the corridors felt cold and too bright. Nurses rushed past with clipboards and trays, voices echoing faintly down the hall. She found the room number and stood outside for a moment, gathering the courage to step in. When she did, she saw him sitting up in bed, his arm in a sling, a faint bruise on his forehead, but still wearing that small, reassuring smile. "You didn't have to come," he said softly, but his tone carried warmth. "Of course I did," she replied, sitting beside him. "You scared everyone," he shrugged gently. "It was just bad timing. I went to check a prop early. The rig wasn't secured." She could tell he was trying to make light of it, but the exhaustion in his eyes betrayed the truth. He was hurting more than he wanted to admit. She handed him a small bag she had brought, tea, a few snacks, and a handwritten note she had scribbled during the drive. Though she didn't tell him that yet. As they talked, she noticed something different in his demeanor. He wasn't his usual calm self. There was a tension beneath his quietness, something that made him glance away now and then as if lost in thought. When she asked what was wrong, he hesitated. Then he said something that made her chest tighten. He told her that while the doctors said he would recover, the accident had shaken him in a way he didn't expect. He said that when the lights fell for a brief second, he thought it was over. And in that second, the only thing that came to his mind was her face. Sandra felt her heart skip a beat. She didn't know what to say. The room suddenly felt smaller, the silence heavier. He looked at her and smiled faintly, but there was something different in that smile. It wasn't just gratitude. It was vulnerability. He said softly, "You've been my reminder that kindness still matters, even when the world forgets." Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him how much his presence had steadied her through her own storms, but before she could, a nurse entered to check his vitals. The moment passed like a whisper in the wind, but its weight lingered between them. Later that evening, when visiting hours ended, Sandra stepped out of the hospital with a strange heaviness in her chest. The night air was cold, but it cleared her thoughts. She realized something had shifted, something quiet but irreversible. The bond between them was no longer just friendship, but neither of them had the courage to name it. The next few days were slow. Production halted, and Sandra spent her mornings checking in with the crew and her evenings visiting Keanu. They talked about everything except what had happened between them that night. He told her about books he was reading, about places he wanted to see again. She told him about her dreams, about her fear of slowing down. about the guilt she carried from never giving herself time to heal. One evening, when she arrived, he was looking out the window, lost in thought. He turned to her and asked if she ever thought about walking away from all of it, the fame, the pressure, the noise. She laughed softly and said she had many times. Then he asked, almost in a whisper, "Would you do it if you had someone to walk away with?" The question hung in the air like a confession. She looked at him, searching his face for what he really meant, but his expression was unreadable. Before she could answer, his phone buzzed. It was a message from the studio. The director wanted to resume filming in a week. Just like that, reality came crashing back in. She nodded, pretending not to be affected, but deep down she knew things would never be the same. The accident had changed him, and it had changed her too. It made her realize how fragile everything was, how a single moment could make you see life differently. A few nights later, as she sat in her car outside her home, she got a text from an unknown number. It was a single sentence. "You shouldn't trust everyone on that set." Her heart started pounding. She read it again, unsure if it was a joke or a warning. She looked out into the empty street, the flicker of a distant street lamp, the only light in the darkness. Something about it felt wrong, too specific, too intentional. She thought about the rig accident, about how it happened before anyone was supposed to be there. And suddenly the unease she had felt that morning returned, sharper this time. She tried calling Keanu, but he didn't answer. The next morning, she went back to the studio earlier than usual. The air was thick with tension. People whispered in corners, and the director looked distracted. She overheard two crew members talking quietly about a missing safety report, the same one filed before the accident. Her stomach twisted. When Keanu arrived later that day, walking slowly but smiling as always, she pulled him aside. She showed him the message. He read it carefully, his expression growing serious. He told her not to worry, but there was a flicker in his eyes that told her he already suspected something. As the day went on, she couldn't focus. Her mind kept circling back to that single message, to the possibility that someone had meant for him to get hurt. And as they filmed their next emotional scene together, one about trust and betrayal, she found it hard to separate the script from the truth. When the cameras stopped rolling, Keanu leaned close and whispered, "Whatever this is, we'll find out. But you need to promise me something." She looked at him, waiting. He said quietly, "Don't face it alone." His words felt like both a warning and a promise. She nodded, but inside a storm was already forming. She could feel it. The story that had started as healing was turning into something darker, something that would test not just their hearts, but their very sense of trust. That night, as she lay in bed, her phone buzzed again. Another message. No name, no number. Just two words this time, "He knows." The shadow behind the light. The night she received that message felt endless. Every sound in her house made her flinch. The hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, even the whisper of wind outside felt amplified. Sandra sat on her couch, the glow of her phone screen the only light in the room. The words "he knows" stared back at her, sharp and cold. She tried to make sense of it, but her mind kept circling the same fear. Who sent it? And what did they mean? The next morning came heavy with unease. She barely slept, and when she looked at herself in the mirror, her eyes told the story her mouth couldn't. She decided to drive to the studio early before anyone else arrived. The streets were still quiet, the city half awake. When she reached the gate, she saw something that made her stop. Keanu's car was already parked there. She found him sitting on the edge of the stage, reading the safety report she had heard about the day before. His expression was calm but tense, his usual stillness laced with something sharper, determination. When she called his name, he looked up and she could tell he hadn't slept either. He told her he had spoken to the crew chief the night before. The missing safety report wasn't missing. It had been removed. Someone had taken it from the production office 2 days before the accident. The realization hit her like a punch. What if the accident wasn't an accident at all? Sandra's first instinct was disbelief. She wanted to think it was paranoia, that maybe people were just careless. But Keanu's tone left no room for comfort. He said he didn't want to jump to conclusions, but he had seen too many things go wrong for no reason. His voice was steady, but she could see the tension in his hands. They agreed not to tell anyone yet, at least until they had proof. They both knew the industry could twist stories, and they didn't want rumors to destroy the film or each other. But deep down, she felt the walls closing in. As filming resumed, everything seemed normal on the surface. The laughter of crew members, the echo of the director's instructions, the sound of the clapperboard, all the familiar rhythms of their world. But underneath that, there was an undercurrent of tension neither could ignore. Sandra noticed things she hadn't before. A camera moved slightly out of place. A spotlight that flickered at the wrong time. A quiet voice that stopped talking when she walked by. During one scene, when the light suddenly dimmed again for a brief second, she froze. The flashback to the accident made her heart pound. Keanu immediately stepped forward, placing a hand on her shoulder, grounding her. His calm presence steadied her breathing, but his eyes searched the shadows above the stage, scanning for something unseen. After the scene, they took a break outside near the trailers. The air was hot, but a faint wind moved through the trees. Keanu leaned against the wall, quiet for a moment, then said something that caught her off guard. "You know," he said, "sometimes kindness makes you a target." She looked at him, confused. He explained that when people see someone who doesn't play by the same cruel rules, it makes them uncomfortable. They mistake compassion for weakness. He said that he had seen it before, people using silence and patience as reasons to test you. His words lingered. She realized that was why he had always been careful, why he moved through the world with such deliberate calm. He wasn't afraid. He was aware. Later that day, while reviewing footage, Sandra noticed something strange. In the raw video from the day of the accident, just seconds before the lights fell, a shadow moved behind the rigging. It was faint, almost unnoticeable, but definitely there. She replayed it several times, her heart racing faster each time. It wasn't one of the usual crew members. This figure was taller, and the movement was deliberate. She called Keanu immediately. He arrived within minutes, his face serious. They watched the clip together in silence. When it ended, he didn't say anything for a long time. Then quietly he said, "We can't ignore this." They decided to take it to the director the next morning. But that night, Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that someone already knew. When she returned to her trailer to collect her things, the door was slightly open. She was sure she had locked it earlier. Inside, everything looked normal at first, until she saw the photo. The same old picture of her and Keanu, the one he had given her, was lying face down on the table. She picked it up slowly, her hand trembling. On the back, written in black marker, were 3 words: "Stop digging deeper." Her breath caught. She looked around the small trailer, her chest tightening. Nothing else seemed disturbed, but that message was enough. She ran outside and called Keanu, her voice shaking as she told him what happened. He told her to stay put and said he was on his way. When he arrived, he checked every corner of the trailer, every lock, every light. Then he sat down across from her and said in that quiet voice of his, "Someone's trying to scare you," she whispered. "Then they're doing a good job." He shook his head. "That's what they want. Fear makes people stop asking questions." They sat there in silence for a long time. Outside, the crickets filled the night with their slow, steady rhythm. She realized how safe she felt with him, even now. His calm wasn't just comforting, it was contagious. He had a way of slowing the chaos, of making her believe that everything could still be okay. Before leaving, he told her to take the next day off, to rest. She refused. She said if she stopped now, the fear would win. He looked at her for a moment, then smiled softly and said, "Then we'll face it together." The next morning, they met the director privately. They showed him the footage, the shadow, and the note. His reaction was strange. Instead of alarm, he looked worried. He told them to keep it quiet, said that making a scene would ruin the film's reputation and panic the investors. He promised to investigate quietly. But when they left his office, Keanu's expression was grim. "He's hiding something," he said. As the days went on, more things started to feel off. A microphone cable snapped during a rehearsal, nearly hitting one of the assistants. An electrical surge fried part of the lighting system again. Each time, the cause was called a technical error. But by now, neither of them believed it. One night, after the crew left, Sandra returned to the studio to pick up her notebook. She noticed Keanu's jacket hanging on a chair near the soundstage. The lights were dim, the place silent. She walked toward the jacket, but as she reached for it, she heard a faint noise. Footsteps behind her. She turned, but no one was there. Then, from the darkness beyond the set walls came a quiet voice. "You should have listened." The words froze her in place. She spun around, her pulse pounding, but saw only the shadows. She backed toward the exit, her hand trembling as she reached for her phone. She texted Keanu one word: help. By the time he arrived, whoever had been there was gone. But the fear wasn't. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely speak. Keanu led her outside, keeping one hand on her shoulder until she steadied her breathing. He said softly, "We're not just dealing with an accident anymore." That night, as they drove away from the studio together, the city lights flickering outside the car windows, Sandra realized how deep they were in. What had started as a story about healing had turned into something darker, something that felt like a test of who they really were when everything safe was stripped away. Keanu glanced at her and said quietly, "Whatever this is, it's not about the film anymore. Someone's trying to break you." She looked out at the empty road ahead and whispered, "Then they don't know who I really am." But deep down, she wasn't sure if she believed her own words. And somewhere, in the distance, a phone buzzed in a dark room. On its screen was a message waiting to be read. "She's getting too close." The truth begins to surface. The next morning arrived heavy and gray, as if the sky itself had grown tired of holding back the storm. Sandra sat by the window of her apartment watching the rain streak across the glass. She hadn't slept much. Every time she closed her eyes, she heard that voice again, the one that whispered from the dark soundstage. Her phone lay on the table beside her, silent and still, yet she couldn't stop glancing at it, half expecting another message to appear. A soft knock on the door startled her. When she opened it, Keanu was standing there, wearing a long coat and carrying 2 cups of tea. His expression was calm, but his eyes told her everything. He hadn't slept either. He walked in quietly, placed the cups on the table, and looked around the room as if checking for danger before sitting down. "I called the director last night," he said softly. "He didn't answer." She frowned. "Maybe he's avoiding us." Keanu nodded slowly. "Or maybe he's already in the middle of something he can't control." They sat in silence for a few moments. The rain outside filled the room with a steady rhythm, like a heartbeat they both shared. Sandra finally spoke. "Do you really think this is someone from the crew?" He hesitated before replying. "I think whoever it is knows us, knows how to get close without being noticed." His words chilled her. She thought about the anonymous messages, the missing report, the shadow in the footage. It wasn't random. It was planned. And whoever was behind it had access to everything: the set, the crew list, even her trailer. After a long pause, Keanu said he had a friend, a retired security consultant who used to work in film productions. He said this friend could quietly check the studio's internal footage and access the deleted records the director claimed didn't exist. Sandra agreed immediately. She didn't care about protocol anymore. She wanted answers. That afternoon, they drove together to meet the man. His name was Leo, a quiet older man with sharp eyes and a gentle voice. He lived on the outskirts of the city in a small house filled with old film reels and camera parts. As they explained what had been happening, Leo listened without interrupting. When they showed him the footage with the shadow and the note from the trailer, he leaned back, thoughtful. After a few minutes, he said something that made both of them go silent. This wasn't random. Whoever did this knows film production equipment. They knew how to time it. The light rig didn't fall by chance. It was triggered. Sandra's breath caught. "Triggered?" He nodded. "The rig's fail-safe cable was removed. That doesn't happen accidentally." Keanu leaned forward. "Can you find out who did it?" Leo sighed. "Maybe. But if the studio logs were altered, it'll take time. I'll need access to their internal server, and that's not something I can do from here." Sandra looked at Keanu. "Then we go back tonight." Keanu shook his head. "Too risky. If they're watching us, they'll know." But her mind was made up. She had been afraid long enough. Later that evening, as darkness settled over the city, they parked near the studio's back entrance. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, the kind that painted the streets in silver reflections. Keanu picked the lock to the maintenance door with quiet precision, his movements practiced and deliberate. Inside, the hallways were dim, the echo of their footsteps the only sound. They made their way to the control room where the footage was stored. The air smelled faintly of dust and metal. Leo guided them over a phone call, directing Keanu to the right cables and ports. As Sandra stood by the door, keeping watch, she felt the weight of everything pressing down on her, the danger, the fear, the quiet trust she had in the man beside her. Keanu finally connected the drive and began copying the hidden files. But before it could finish, footsteps echoed in the hallway. They froze. Sandra turned off the monitor light and the room plunged into near darkness. She held her breath as the footsteps drew closer. The door handle moved. Keanu stepped in front of her instinctively, his hand motioning for silence. Whoever was outside paused for a moment, then walked away. They waited another minute before breathing again. Sandra could feel her heart pounding against her ribs. When the transfer finally completed, Keanu pocketed the drive. They slipped out the same way they came in, their movements quiet but tense. Once they were safely in the car, Sandra turned to him. "What's on it?" He shook his head. "We'll find out soon." The drive led them back to Leo's house. It took him nearly an hour to decrypt the files. The rain had stopped by then, leaving the world soaked and silent. When he finally spoke, his voice was tight. "You should both see this." On the screen was security footage from the day of the accident. The angle was from an overhead camera not listed in the official logs. It showed a man adjusting the rigging moments before it fell. His face wasn't fully visible, but when he turned slightly toward the light, Sandra gasped. She knew that face. It was someone from the production team, Michael, the assistant stage manager. Quiet, polite, always helpful, always around. She remembered how he had been the one to comfort her after the accident, telling her it was just bad luck. But there he was, loosening the cable before walking away. Keanu clenched his jaw. Why would he do that? Leo rewound the footage and pointed to the timestamp. Look closer. He's wearing a headset. Someone's talking to him. The audio feed was weak, filled with static, but a single voice came through faintly, a voice they both recognized immediately. It was the director. Sandra's body went cold. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The man who had told them to stay quiet, to protect the studio's reputation, had been part of it. She looked at Keanu, who sat completely still, his eyes dark and unreadable. Leo paused the video. This wasn't just about the film. There's money involved. Insurance, production delays, payouts. If something went wrong, certain people stood to gain a lot. Sandra covered her mouth, her thoughts spinning. All the fear, all the manipulation. It had been part of a setup. She was never the target. Keanu was. The film was insured heavily under his name as one of the lead producers. The accident was meant to disable him, delay filming, and trigger the insurance claim. But something had gone wrong. He had survived. Keanu exhaled slowly, his calm voice breaking the silence. So it was never about us. It was about control. Sandra's eyes welled up. They tried to hurt you. He looked at her with that quiet gentleness she had come to depend on. And they almost broke you to do it. For a moment, neither spoke. The truth had brought no comfort, only a deeper sadness. They both realized how easily kindness and trust could be twisted by greed. But then, Keanu's expression changed. We can't just expose them. They'll deny everything. We need proof, enough to make it impossible for them to hide. Leo nodded. The full conversation log from that headset should still be in the server. If we can pull the audio, you'll have what you need. Sandra looked at the dark window, her reflection pale against the rain-soaked glass. She whispered, "Then we finish this. Tomorrow." As they left Leo's house that night, the streets were empty, washed clean by the rain. Sandra looked over at Keanu, who drove in silence, his focus sharp, his mind somewhere far away. She thought about all the things he had endured quietly, the grief, the loneliness, the betrayal, and how, even now, he carried it with grace. She realized that what made him different wasn't his strength, but his gentleness. In a world built on noise, he was proof that silence could be powerful. But somewhere deep inside her, a new fear began to grow. If they were right, if the director really was behind it, then confronting him would be dangerous. And this time, kindness alone might not save them. As the car turned onto the dark highway, a figure stepped out of the shadows by the roadside, watching their tail lights disappear. The figure pulled out a phone and whispered into it, "They know." The final silence the next morning broke with an eerie calm. The storm had passed, but the city felt quiet in a way that didn't feel right. Sandra stood by her window, watching the faint sunlight try to break through the clouds. Her mind was heavy with everything they had learned the night before. The betrayal, the manipulation, the quiet cruelty hidden behind fake smiles. It still didn't feel real. When Keanu arrived, he didn't have to say anything. The look in his eyes told her he was ready. They had agreed the night before that today would be the day they ended this. The lies, the fear, the silence. He handed her a small drive, the one containing the recovered footage and audio logs. Leo had stayed up all night decrypting the files, pulling every fragment of truth from the corrupted data. What they had now was enough to expose everything. As they drove toward the studio, neither of them spoke. The hum of the car filled the silence, steady but tense. The streets were wet and gleaming, reflections of light rippling like ghosts on the asphalt. Sandra watched Keanu's face in the soft morning light, calm, focused, unshaken. She thought of all the times he had carried others' pain without complaint, how his kindness had been both his shield and his wound. When they arrived, the studio looked the same as always, bright banners, crew trucks, laughter echoing from the cafeteria. But beneath that normal surface, something darker waited. The director was already there, sitting in his office with the door half open, pretending everything was fine. Keanu walked in first. Sandra followed, holding the drive in her hand like a small, heavy truth. The director looked up and forced a smile. "You're both early," he said. "We're resuming the shoot today." Keanu's voice was quiet but steady. "No, we're not." The smile faded. "What's that supposed to mean?" Sandra stepped forward, placing the drive on his desk. "It means we know everything." The silence that followed was suffocating. The director's face shifted, first confusion, then recognition, then something darker. He leaned back slowly, trying to keep his composure. "You have no idea what you're talking about." Keanu's eyes never left his. "We know about the rig. We know about Michael. We know about the insurance deal. And we know who gave the order." The director's hand twitched. "This isn't what you think." "Then explain it," Sandra said softly. "Explain why your voice is on the recording." His calm cracked for the first time. He looked from her to Keanu, his expression hardening. "You don't understand how this business works. Accidents happen, things get covered, money moves, it's not personal." Keanu's voice turned colder than she had ever heard it. "You nearly killed people." The director leaned forward, his tone sharpening. "And you think anyone will believe you? I control this production. You're actors. You can't win this." Sandra looked at him, her voice quiet but firm. "You're wrong. Because this isn't about winning. It's about telling the truth." Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Before the director could react, he turned the screen toward him. It was already recording and had been since they walked in. The director froze. His mouth opened, then closed again. The silence stretched between them, heavy and final. Sandra took a deep breath. "You told me once that silence can protect people," she said, looking at Keanu. "But sometimes breaking it saves them." The director stood abruptly, panic flickering across his face. "You don't know what you're doing," he hissed. "This will destroy everything." Keanu met his gaze calmly. "Then maybe it should." They walked out without another word, leaving the man staring at the drive that would end his career. Outside, the sunlight had finally broken through, warm and clear after days of gray. Sandra felt her chest tighten with relief and something close to peace. Later that day, they met Leo at a small cafe near the coast. The files had already been sent to the authorities and the insurance board. There was no going back now. Leo told them quietly that the evidence was more than enough. Arrests would follow. Truth once again would make its slow way through the noise. Sandra sat by the window, watching the waves crash gently against the rocks. For the first time in months, she didn't feel the weight of fear pressing down on her. She turned to Keanu, who was staring at the horizon, his hands wrapped around a cup of tea. "Do you ever regret being too kind?" she asked softly. He thought for a long moment before answering. "No, people can twist kindness, but they can't erase it. It always leaves something good behind, even when it hurts." His words made her smile, the same quiet, grateful smile she had given him that first day on set. She realized that through all the pain, fear, and betrayal, what had kept them going wasn't anger or revenge. It was grace. The grace to feel, to care, to stay human in a world that often forgot what that meant. As the sun began to set, painting the ocean in shades of gold and crimson, she leaned back and whispered, "You saved me." "You know," Keanu shook his head, "no, you saved yourself. I just reminded you that you could." The sound of waves filled the silence between them, soft and steady. She closed her eyes and let the warmth of the light touch her face. For the first time in a long while, she wasn't acting. She was just living, quietly, fully, and without fear. Months later, when the film finally released, it carried a quiet dedication at the end. No names, no explanations. Just 7 simple words fading gently across the screen. For those who choose kindness anyway. The audience sat in silence when the credits rolled, unaware of the truth behind those words, unaware of how close it had come to ending differently. But for Sandra and Keanu, it was enough. They didn't need the world to know every detail. They had lived it. And as they stood side by side at the premiere, their eyes met for a brief second, sharing the kind of understanding that needed no words. 2 souls scarred but not broken. 2 hearts that had learned that strength wasn't about being unshakable. It was about being gentle, even when the world wasn't. That night, as they walked out of the theater together, the city lights shimmered like distant stars. Sandra looked up at the sky and whispered, almost to herself, "Maybe peace doesn't mean the storm ends. Maybe it just means we stop fearing the rain." Keanu smiled, the faint glow of the streetlight catching his face. "And maybe," he said quietly, "that's where healing begins." They kept walking until the noise of the world faded, their steps quiet, their hearts steady. Somewhere behind them, the city buzzed with stories, secrets, and lights. But for them, there was only calm, the kind that comes after surviving something you never thought you would. And though they would never speak about it again, both knew that in the silence they shared that night, something eternal had been born, a promise, a peace, and a truth that would never need to be proven.